A phone screen showed a volatile stock chart with a towering spike and steep drop. A person stared and whispered disbelief at the numbers and candles on the screen. Nearby colleagues traced the movement and cursed at the impossible chart out loud. Two suited men hurried down a corridor, discussing regulatory fallout and the headlines. Outside, the crowd gathered around phones and pointed to the same chart. Someone declared regulators could not ignore the pattern any longer, and action would follow. Laughter rose as people scrolled and shared screenshots on social feeds. The phone remained the proof and the punchline for everyone. A phone holder displayed Questcoin's candlestick screen, showing a sharp spike and quick collapse. Colleagues focused on the 509 figure and argued about forcing a pump. One instructed traders to put in money and push the charts higher. Candles climbed until a sudden crash blew out the gains and shattered the momentum. A pale man laughed and boasted about taking money from small investors. He was named NewAgeManhwa and presented as the team's chairman and leader. Outside, suits and onlookers murmured, while crowd laughers shared screenshots and mocked regulators' helplessness. In a narrow corridor, suits pressed a man to commit the remaining funds and sell the miners. The man declined a car and instead asked directly for cash to be handed over. A senior voice questioned whether anyone would take responsibility for the move. One man smiled through the exchange. They exited arguing about fairness and leverage. The donor finally accepted a car as partial repayment and handed something over. At the harbor, small boats bobbed while a lone man sat among them. A final voice ordered understanding and left the man staring at the water. The wounded man knelt and pleaded for mercy as the group surrounded him. NewAgeManhwa stepped forward and asked if the man had a daughter. He said she was his whole reason to live. He begged them to let him go and offered whatever money remained. The men exchanged looks and the taller suit kept a silent stare. NewAgeManhwa's voice finally asked for an answer and the group waited. Nearby harbor lights glinted on the water as the man's pleas faded. The wounded man had knelt and begged while the group closed around him. NewAgeManhwa stepped forward and challenged the group's justification outright. He spat that the claim was fucking bullshit and voiced the harsh accusation against the accused. Voices traded denials about small missions and responsibility. One man insisted they had been forced into the work and apologized. The argument escalated when someone brandished a metal bar as proof of intent. NewAgeManhwa observed that everyone in such situations carried their own reason. The crowd fell quiet under the harbor lights. The injured man choked and repeated denials as blood stained his face. The harbor fell into silence under dim lights. A phone screen displayed a chart and messages that altered the mood. Alone on the pier, NewAgeManhwa stood and listened before declaring that it was time. He heard the quiet reply that this action might not be enough. Someone muttered about being led into a trap at this place. Suit-clad men formed two rows in the corridor. They watched NewAgeManhwa walk into their ranks. The injured man choked and repeated denials as blood stained his face. The harbor fell into silence beneath the dim harbor lights and rain. Earlier, a phone screen had displayed a chart that shifted the mood among onlookers. Alone on the pier, NewAgeManhwa stood and listened before deciding to act. Later, he sat in a university classroom where a professor wrote a problem on the board. The professor asked who would solve it, and the class waited in silence. NewAgeManhwa raised his hand and declared the answer without using a calculator. The room shifted to stunned quiet as peers registered his claim and method. After the classroom fell silent at NewAgeManhwa's solution, a classmate approached him. She offered him a chance to attend a club meeting later that day. He smiled briefly and apologized. He said he needed to meet his parents and could not go. She showed mild disappointment but pushed once more. They walked out together across the sunlit campus. Voices and footsteps receded as they passed brick buildings. The last panel presented a stark caption that cut the scene and hinted at selection. Suits huddled in a corridor while the phone holder displayed a stock chart. Onlookers clustered and shared glances as crowd laughers raised their phones. A lone student walked past, unreadable expression, and moved down sunlit steps. Later, a donor crouched on his knees and begged, admitting he had spent all the funds. Voices rose, two men argued and pointed. Yu Bayam stood nearby and watched, his face hardening. He did not reply at first. The scene closed on his quiet resolve and the shocked faces around him. The corridor argument spiraled and then became physical. Two men exchanged blows and one collapsed to the floor. The fallen man wailed and begged, while nearby people drew back and shouted. A young woman paused at the doorway and watched, stunned. Another man grabbed the prone figure and pressed for answers. Yu Bayam remained near the edge of the crowd and watched without moving. Tension tightened around the scene until a bespectacled man stepped forward and finally spoke to the group. The corridor argument had become violent and then collapsed into a single wounded man. Two men traded blows and one fell screaming as onlookers recoiled. A young woman froze at the doorway while another man leaned over the prone figure and demanded answers. Yu Bayam stayed along the crowd's edge and did not move. A bespectacled man stepped forward and spoke, briefly restoring order. Afterwards the injured begged, and the scene cut to a somber memorial portrait on a pedestal. A lone figure sat on the stairs and stared as the bespectacled man brooded internally. The scene ended with a sudden cry of "Mom" during the confusion. The corridor argument escalated into a violent brawl and left one man wounded and pleading. Onlookers recoiled while two suited men and a tattooed assailant traded accusations and blows. A bespectacled man stepped forward and briefly restored order as the crowd parted. They carried the donor away and later placed the framed portrait on a pedestal in solemn silence. Yu Bayam lingered at the crowd's edge and watched without intervening. The sequence cut to a hospital room where the protagonist woke weak and disoriented. Recovery took days and money was scarce, so the protagonist stopped attending school and worked labor. He practiced his fists in alleys and fought until a glass pane shattered. A few days later, they regrouped in a private lounge. Two suited men handed a younger associate a cover and promised to back him. Yu Bayam sat across in a white suit and listened as they discussed recruiting and buying favors. Drinks were offered and brief assurances were exchanged. The protagonist stood near the doorway and watched without moving. The men spoke plainly about a world ordered for the wealthy and the limits that protected those at the top. The protagonist registered the lines and held his silence as the plan took shape. They remained in the private lounge. Two suited men pressed their plan and spoke plainly about buying influence. Yu Bayam listened in a white suit and asked measured questions. Brief assurances passed between them as the plan took shape. The protagonist stood by and watched, registering each line and flaw. One suited man derided the neighborhood and praised easy gullibility. Drinks were offered and a bottle was handed for approval. The protagonist examined the label, then prepared to pour. A waiter was summoned before the glass was served. They stayed in the private lounge as words hardened into a proposed plan. One suited man mocked the neighborhood while the other laid out payment channels. Yu Bayam listened in a white suit and asked careful, pointed questions. A bottle was produced for inspection, and the protagonist turned the label slowly. A waiter was called, and the glass sat ready on a low table. One man declared the drink on the house, and tension sharpened in the room. The protagonist measured the offer, and his expression gave nothing away then. Voices dropped and the waiter moved to pour as the plan solidified. They remained in the private lounge as a plan hardened around the table. One suited man mocked the neighborhood while the other detailed payment channels. Yu Bayam sat in a white suit and asked careful, pointed questions. A bottle was produced and the phone holder turned its label slowly for inspection. Voices lowered and the waiter moved to pour the glass on the low table. One man declared the drink on the house and the room's tension sharpened. The protagonist's face gave nothing away, though he measured the offer carefully. Elsewhere he remembered a framed portrait and a line about being alone. Laughter rose from the crowd laughers, and the mockery pushed him to run. He vowed he would take everything from them and then begin a long campaign. He shut himself away and focused daily on researching cryptocurrency and digital traces. He worked the streets, fought when needed, and kept phone records as proof. He collected names, screenshots, and movements, compiling dossiers from profiles and messages. For 3 years, he built maps, followed leads, and organized plans to destroy them. He returned to the monitors, ready to act on the intelligence he had gathered. A man with a gold chain observed and spoke with a mocking, confident tone. He vowed he would take everything from them and then begin a long campaign. He shut himself away and focused daily on researching cryptocurrency and digital traces. He collected names, screenshots, and movements, and for 3 years he built maps and dossiers to prepare. On the streets he cornered a target, beat him until he begged, and warned that any mention of his sister Hawk would earn death. He walked away while bystanders watched. Later, 2 men compared a full-back tattoo and shrugged at the thought of public notice. He had sworn to strip them of everything and then prepared in secret for years. He threw away his old life and became the same kind of evil as his targets. He bore a full-back tattoo like those men. He had compiled names, screenshots, and movement maps to plan his moves. He joined a cryptocurrency firm, called One, to gain access. He found many staff were former gang members who had caused massive losses. He promised to bring every one of them down and then revealed himself as Yu Bayam, 28, newly enrolled at One. He had spent years preparing in secret and had rewritten his life to match his targets. He joined One undercover to access staff and records. Standing before One's glass tower, he read the card and thought of the firm's criminal past. He knew many employees had once been gang members and had caused billion-won losses. He stepped onto the plaza and announced his intention to dismantle them. He revealed himself as Yu Bam, 28, and newly enrolled at One. People around him murmured and stared. 3 months later, the One Tower filled the page. He thought back to his mission to break the coin power and to the decision he had made months earlier. Workers on the phone warned others not to join the politics coin and called it dangerous. Someone muttered that Chairman Jung never showed his face. The protagonist kept his head down and continued mopping. He had been cleaning floors for 3 months and had to endure gossip while he waited for a chance to act. 3 months later, the One Tower's gossip had followed him into the workrooms. A man from strategy, Yo Minggu, smirked while holding up a phone and a chart. He taunted the cleaning newbie and demanded to see the newcomer's hands. The protagonist kept his head down and continued mopping without answering. The man grew louder, cursing and accusing unnamed enemies he claimed existed. As the insult landed, the protagonist focused inward and tested his balance. He located his left foot and the center of balance before moving. 3 months later, the One Tower's gossip had followed him into workrooms. A smirking man from strategy held up a phone and a chart while taunting him. The protagonist kept his head down and tested his balance by locating his left foot. He touched the mop pivot and used the leverage to unbalance the larger man. The man crashed to the floor amid shocked silence and a loud thud. The protagonist thought the 3 years he spent rolling on streets had not been in vain. He offered a quiet apology and called the action a reflex. The large man erupted in furious disbelief and shouted insults down the corridor. 3 months later, the One Tower's gossip had followed him into workrooms. A smirking man from strategy had shown a phone chart to taunt him. He used the mop pivot to unbalance the larger man, who crashed to the floor. Silence followed the thud, and he offered a brief apology to the corridor. A large worker then blocked an entry and spoke in a blunt tone. The protagonist answered with one-word Peltix coin and named the asset. He pointed at the chart and warned breaking the resistance line would spark an ants buying trend. The corridor held a tense quiet as the worker absorbed the prediction. 3 months on the tower gossip still threaded work corridors. Kim Myung explained a hard fork scheduled months ahead and argued Peltix coin would trigger an ants buying wave once resistance broke. The large cleaner froze, then scowled, muttered disbelief, and spat a curse at the claim. 2 men crossed the hall, and one called Yo Minggu from behind. Kim Myung pivoted in the doorway, addressed Yo Minggu, and asked why he lingered when the conference was about to start. The corridor held a taut quiet after her interruption. 3 months after the tower rumors began, the corridor still thrummed with gossip. Kim Myung's hard fork explanation had stirred grudging disbelief among workers. The cleaning bully froze, scowled, and spat an insult aimed at the newcomer. Nearby voices speculated about the young man's looks and his background. Someone recited Yu Bayam's past, 26 years old, enrolled then dropped out from Korea University's economics department. The small revelation shifted the room's weight. At the doorway, a leader curtly ordered the young man to join the conference. The corridor held its breath as he gathered himself. Kim Myung named the operation's target as Crystal Coin and showed its price chart. She noted the coin's market cap was about $30 billion and daily volume about 1 billion. She told them acquisition had ended and the team now needed to raise the price. Kim Myung said they had a good environment to shake the market. She described their tactic as a bicycle trade and pointed to recent volatility. The room watched the chart and waited as leaders prepared to act. Kim Myung had identified Crystal Coin as the operation's target and briefed the room on its market metrics. She said acquisition was finished, and the next phase required raising the price through a planned bicycle trade exploiting recent volatility. The attendees realized the gathering served that purpose rather than a normal conference. A tattooed man sat silent as the realization landed. One member volunteered to lead the pump. A large cap-wearing colleague laughed and wondered if they could double the price while noting about $1 billion. The room paused and waited for the first orders. Kim Myung had already declared Crystal Coin the operation's target and outlined the pump plan. The phone holder then leaned forward and displayed a chart, urging a large buy and suggesting about 15 billion won. A cap-wearing colleague exploded and accused him of joking, slamming the table. Kim Myung leaned back and stated that the coin was merely an object and that reckless heads would ruin them. The room tightened and questioned the chart's pattern, debating the so-called mandibular formation. The attendees sat waiting for the first orders after the heated exchange. Kim Myung had already named Crystal Coin the target and explained the pump plan. The phone holder had shown the chart, and a cap-wearing teammate had slammed the table in disbelief. The room argued about the pattern and waited for orders. Then a man quietly offered 500,000 won and claimed he could multiply it 3 times. Faces tightened and a woman and others stared. He pleaded directly with team leader Kim. A large cap-wearing member jumped up and shouted, mocking the idea of painting a chart with only 500,000 won. Kim Myung had identified Crystal Coin and outlined the pump plan. The phone holder displayed the chart, while a cap-wearing team member slammed the table in disbelief. The room argued about the pattern and awaited orders. A small investor had offered 500,000 won and pleaded directly with Kim. The debate shifted to tactics and timing. One speaker argued the fight was not about capital, but about timing and the ant's psychology. A man claimed he had studied the ants and charts until he nearly vomited. The cap man lost his temper and threatened the speaker. Voices rose until one young man demanded release of the held hand before speaking. The hat-wearing man snarled that he would repeat earlier consequences if challenged. Tempers flared and others recoiled at the threat. A senior voice cut across the room and ordered both to stop. Kim Myung then addressed the group and apologized to the newcomer. She had a price chart displayed behind her as visual evidence. She denied authority to hand the operation to the newcomer. She said the conference existed to show how the company was run. Cap Guy appealed to Yo Mingu's point and said using too much brain cost coin. Protagonist replied simply no and then explained why that claim was wrong. He argued failure came from using the brain only up to a fixed level. The group cried out and several faces registered sudden surprise and clear doubt. Kim Myung refused the offer and insisted the task remained impossible regardless of smarts. A senior voice cut in and directed them to leave it to the protagonist. The boardroom quieted as the one sign framed the newcomer and the decision. A woman paused and registered a familiar voice. She thought the speaker might be Chairman Yong. The man stepped forward and spoke with calm menace, noting the 500,000 won suggestion. He said the newcomer deserved attention and ordered the group to watch. He gave the protagonist a single week to prove himself. He warned that failure would mean being fish food. The room tightened around the seated young man as cap guy, and the large enforcers closed ranks and waited for the verdict. After the corridor confrontation, the group moved into a private room with an aquarium wall. An unknown man sat facing the tank and addressed the captive struggling inside. He clarified his threat was literal fish food and watched the victim choke. The captive gurgled apologies and then screamed as bubbles and blood rose. Observers tightened and waited in tense silence for the speaker to render judgment. He then smiled and announced there was a vacancy for the designer position. He framed it as an ultimatum for the newcomer to prove himself. After the corridor confrontation, the group moved into a private room with an aquarium wall. An unknown man had announced a vacancy and framed the hire as an ultimatum. The protagonist heard Chairman Jung's name and felt the memory rush back. He recalled a day of cold fury and a need for measured action. He told himself this was not the time for sudden self-destruction.